Welcome to Psychiatry, Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Board Study Edition. I am your host, Dr. O'Leary, a Child and Adolescent Psychiatry Fellow in the National Capital Region. This is a podcast I designed to help myself and other CAPS Fellows study for their boards. But anyone interested in human development or in mental health, especially child and adolescent mental health, will get something out of this. For a description of how I produce this podcast, please go all the way back to episode 1. I tell you that because I'm using AI to assist me with the content creation, and that describes how I do it. Even though I'm using AI, I want to make sure you know that all the content in this podcast should be considered to be my own opinion and no one else's. I don't have an editorial staff. I'm not doing this on behalf of any other organization. It's just me. This is episode 5. The last episode explored how Freud's psychoanalytic theory was applied to children by his daughter, Anna Freud, and then by the early theorists of object relations, Melanie Klein and Margaret Mahler. I'm now moving on to a very, very different way of describing development. Jean Piaget's theory of cognitive development is markedly different from psychosexual and psychoanalytic approaches. He was concerned primarily with cognitive abilities. Instead of just, basically making up a complex inner life and mode of relating to mommy's breasts, etc., he described the kind of cognitive tasks that children are actually increasingly able to do as they age. Unlike Sigmund Freud and Melanie Klein, but more like Anna and Margaret Mahler, he actually studied child development in the real world. We don't know whether, as Klein speculated, that infants have this complex unconscious fantasy life where they split mom into good and bad and then later regret that fantasy. This is irrelevant to the content of Piaget's work. He advanced the science of child psychiatry not by speculating about why children do what they do, but by actually describing what they do. Now, I'm belaboring this point because careful observation and classification is the first step in science. Long before you can make a hypothesis even, you need to do that. And it's a step that both Freud and Klein skipped. They started by theorizing, and then they decided to try to classify things. That's not science. Now, to be fair, once a strongly supported scientific theory has been demonstrated, then one can start to try to explain particular things based on applying that theory. But a real science of child development was barely in its infancy when Sigmund and Klein were basically just making things up. Piaget, through careful observations, proposed 4 distinct stages of cognitive development, and each was marked by some qualitative and quantitative changes in how individuals perceive the world and reason about it. Now, as I go over this, I want you to keep in mind that research since Piaget has shown that children's mental skills probably develop faster and earlier than Piaget supposed that they did. Now, their ability to actually demonstrate these mental abilities probably lags behind their actual acquisition of them. But that's a technical detail that I'm just going to try to keep in mind when I'm thinking about Piaget. Here's a quick overview of how these stages unfold, and then I'm going to go back into each of them into more nitty-gritty detail. From birth to about 2 years of age, we have the sensory motor stage. In this stage, one of the key words to remember is object permanence, and that's the understanding that things continue to exist even when they're out of sight, or more generally, out of the sensory space. And that's one of the main things that helps children to build a foundation for their future cognitive development, to help them to reason about the world, knowing that the world still exists, even when it's not being sensed by them. The next stage is 2 to 7 years, and this is called the pre-operational stage. In this stage, symbolic thought becomes more important. So they start to use language and images to represent ideas. In this stage, kids are very egocentric. That means they have a hard time taking another person's perspective, but they're developing the tools that they'll need later to do that. There's another word to keep in mind. It's called centration. And centration is when kids focus on kind of like one aspect of a situation or idea, as if that's the really only important thing. So they have a limited ability to consider multiple facets of the same thing. When they're around 7 and until they're about 12 years old, they're in what Piaget called the concrete operational stage. In this stage, children develop a good understanding of like the ideas of conservation. So that's where properties like mass or volume or other numerical things can remain constant despite changing their appearance or changing the container that they're put in. From ages 7 to 12, kids also develop more of a sense of reversibility. So that's where they can use their mind to kind of go backwards in time instead of forward, or backwards in a causal relationship instead of just one step at a time forward. Here is where they're learning logical reasoning about more or less concrete things in the world. And by concrete, I don't mean made out of stone. I mean things that are kind of easy to draw a circle around. When they hit about 12 years of age and then onward, Piaget calls this the formal operational stage. So here is where kids start abstract thinking. They can do hypothetical reasoning. They can do systematic problem solving using both deductive and inductive reasoning. And according to Piaget, from 12 onward, cognitively, it's just about people perfecting those skills. But let me go back and enter into each stage one at a time in a lot more detail. So here are the substages of Piaget's stages of cognitive development. First, the sensory motor stage. So the first part of the sensory motor stage is something called simple reflex. And this is from about birth to around 1 month of age. Here is where the reflexes that kids were born with really dominate their behaviors. So they can't really do a lot. They haven't learned a lot about the world, but they have been programmed with things like sucking, rooting, grasping, in order to interact with their environment in a way that they can just survive. Survive long enough to learn more complex things. These are automatic, built-in responses. The next substage of the sensory motor stage is called the primary circular reactions by Piaget, and this is from about 1 to 4 months of age. According to Piaget, kids repeat things, especially pleasurable actions, over and over and over again. And it's all centered around what they can control, which is basically just their own body and anything like in the immediate vicinity of their body, like the breast. So they begin to coordinate their sensory experiences with their motor actions. They might, for example, repeatedly do things like suck their thumb, or they might make a noise because it kind of feels cool and it gets a reaction out of mom. But they're intentionally doing things. It's not just a reflex. So that's what Piaget called primary circular reactions until around 4 months of age. At 4 to 8 months, Piaget talks about secondary circular reactions. So these are not just like the infant's own body, how they're able to grasp things or sounds they're able to make. These are repetitive actions focused on external objects in the environment. You can have accidental or incidental interactions, and then those can be repeated by the infant over and over and over again because they realize now they can affect the world around them. So these are maybe things like using the rattle or being able to move something from one hand to another. During secondary circular reactions, infants become much more interested about the world around them. They'll do things like drop something because it's cool to watch it fall and then listen to it hit the ground. And then, of course, mom will pick it up and give it back to them. It's pleasure in manipulating the external world, and that's 4 to 8 months. Around 8 months, Piaget talks about coordination of secondary circular reactions. So these are far more intentional, kind of goal-oriented behaviors. And this is where object permanence really starts to emerge as a thing. According to Piaget, infants develop these things called schemas about the world. And these schemas are basically ideas or concepts. And around 8 to 12 months, they can start to use these schemas to acquire things from the environment that they want or change the environment so that they can get what they want. For instance, they might be able to, say, move an obstacle out of a way in order to reach a desired toy, like pick up a blanket, or they may be able to grab something and pull it to them and then use it to manipulate something else in the environment. If you remember back to episode 2, where I talked about things kids can just be seen to be doing at different developmental stages, kind of like milestones, we call them, you'll remember that around 7 or 8 months of age, they start crawling around. They get really interactive with their environment now. They're not just passively receiving things that are given to them. But then by around 1 year, well, they start to pull themselves up and maybe even walk around the environment. So as they're learning to walk, cognitively, they're advancing as well. Now, during the 12 to 18 month stage, this is where Piaget refers to kids as little scientists. So they're doing lots of things to see what happens. They actively explore their environment. They might change their actions to observe the result. Instead of doing the same thing over and over and over repetitively, they can change what they do to see if they get a better result. You might drop a toy from different heights to see how it lands. This little scientist, where kids are just going out into the world, changing what they do, seeing that different circumstances result in different outcomes. That is active inference, although Piaget didn't call it that. The next stage Piaget describes is early symbolic thought. So this is around 18 months to around 2 years of age. Here, kids are developing more mental representations of objects, and their schemas are becoming more realistic, you might say. Here they start to engage in pretend play because they have these well-built ideas and concepts in their mind. They can manipulate those. They can imitate actions that they've observed in the past instead of just like immediately imitating something that they just saw. So this is the early symbolic thought. And this is where the ideas some of the ideas that Piaget is known for come into play. And I want to stop here and go over those. The first is schema, which I talked about. Schema refers to a mental framework. It's a concept. It's a way that we organize and interpret information in our environment. The second is a process called assimilation. So assimilation is when we're incorporating new information into our existing schemas. So we've already built this concept, and then we're trying to fit what we see about the world into that concept. Piaget calls this assimilation. The next is called accommodation. So accommodation is where the schema itself will be adjusted or changed to fit new information from the environment. So whereas assimilation is just trying to fit information from the environment into a pre-existing schema, accommodation is where you change the schema itself in order to be consistent with the sensory information coming in from the environment. So that was the sensory motor stage from about birth to around 2 years of age. Now, come around 2 years of age, Piaget describes the pre-operational stage, and it's characterized by a lot of cognitive advancements. But it's also limited. There are constraints. We're not quite to the more operational, like concrete and formal operational stage. We're getting there. So here's some of the technical details of Piaget's pre-operational stage from about 2 to 7 years. From around 2 to 4 years, or what we call like the toddler years, children begin to use a lot more symbols to represent objects and ideas. They're starting to engage in pretend play, and they can use one object to represent another thing. So they could use like a piece of wood to be a phone, or they can use a doll to act as their baby. They're also developing language skills. So language skills really are just kind of symbolic functional skills because you use words to represent objects and also to represent ideas. And then you put these words together in different orders. And so this symbolic functional stage, not just about ideas and things in the environment, but how we communicate those to other people. And then come around 4 years to around 7 years of age, there is the intuitive thought substage. So Piaget describes children as asking a lot of questions. They're super curious about the world, but they don't have to actually explore it themselves to know. They can ask, and they can be told, and they can incorporate told information more readily into their schemas. They also start to rely a lot on intuition rather than kind of intentional, structured, logical reasoning to understand the world. They start to have more insight into how what they're feeling about a situation um, means for the consequences of what's going to happen in that situation. They still struggle with things that are kind of harder to understand, like conservation tasks. So you give a 4 to 7 year old 2 glasses of water with the same amount of water in, but one of them is a little bit skinnier, so the water goes up higher. They'll say that that glass has more water in it, even if they saw you like pour the exact same amount of water into both. They'll say this one has more. Part of that is understanding conservation of water, but part of that's also understanding that the word more is being applied only to the water itself and not to the height of the water. This pre-operational stage with the symbolic functional stage from around 2 to 4 years and the intuitive thought substage from around 4 to 7 years is roughly equivalent to the time periods when Freud was talking about the phallic stage. And he emphasized someone's like sexual conflicts. Piaget is emphasizing a kid's cognitive abilities. So, in the pre operational stage, the main things to remember are that symbolic thought becomes a lot more important. And this is especially seen in how they can use language to represent different things. In this stage, kids are very egocentric. They really can't imagine other people's views of the world very readily. Um, they believe that other people have the same kind of feelings or thoughts about the world that they do, and they have to unlearn, that egocentrism is what we call it. In this pre-operational stage, they do what's called centration, where they focus on like one aspect of a situation at a time, kind of ignoring all the other relevant factors, because it's really hard for them to consider too many things. And they're starting to do that, but they're bad at it. So this leads to a lot of errors in reasoning. There's something else going on in this stage too. It's called animism. And this is related to egocentrism, I think, but children often attribute human like qualities to inanimate objects. And so they might say or believe something like the sun is angry, or that the toy has some sort of feeling. This is called animism by Piaget. After the pre-operational stage, around 7 years old, Piaget describes the concrete operational stage. And it's called concrete because kids can really reason about simple things like actual objects in the world. In the concrete operational stage between 7 and 11, there's really not a lot of substages described. It's more like what can they do. So during this stage, they develop the ability, if they're taught, to understand like the conservation of matter, that there are different properties of objects, and that these properties can remain constant even when things appear to change. You have the same number of things, whether they're stacked together, put into a bag, whether they're spread out. There's still the same number of things, or the same volume of stuff, or the same amount of stuff. And they start to be able to kind of reverse operations. So instead of just thinking in terms of cause and effect, they can be like, the effect had a cause, that cause had a cause. And it also allows them to realize that things can be undone. So just because something was broken doesn't mean it's going to remain broken. It's not in a state of brokenness forever. It can be fixed. Or you can prevent something from happening because you know the antecedent. In the pre-operational stage, we talked about centration, where there's kids can really only think about one aspect of a thing at a time. Now they start to develop decentration. So that is the ability to consider multiple aspects of that situation simultaneously. This allows them to solve more complex problems. It allows them to understand relationships between things that previously they'd have difficulty being able to understand. In this concrete operational stage, they start becoming very good at classifying things. So they will become very good at sorting objects into different types of categories based on their similarities. And they'll understand that there are different categories that overlap. So just because something's in one category doesn't mean it can't be in another category. So all the round things together, all the red things together, some of the red things might be square and round, but they're all red. So redness does not imply roundness. Roundness does not necessarily imply redness. Things like that. They'll be able to understand that a poodle is a dog, but a poodle is also an animal, and a poodle is also a mammal. That not all animals are mammals, that not all mammals are dogs, that sort of thing. They can also do something called seriation. So that's where they can kind of arrange objects in order based on whatever type of condition that you're applying ahead of time. So you could do by size. You could say sort these by size. You could say sort these by weight. So they'll be able to put the same objects in multiple different kinds of series. They'll also be able to understand what's called the transitive inference. So the transitive inference is like this. If A is taller than B and B is taller than C, then A is taller than C. So this basic kind of logic comes into play. It is only when kids reach the formal operational stage, which Piaget says begins around 12 years of age, that they start to have this shift where they can think forward and backward. They can think deductively and inductively. They can think abstractly. They can start to tell more complex stories. They're not necessarily so egocentric. They can imagine other people have similar or different motivations from themselves. So in the formal operational stage, there's some key things that they develop. One is the abstract thinking. So they can have concepts that really have no physical reference. Ideas like freedom, um, ideas like seriousness. Right? So they can think in abstract. Like there's not a concrete object tying them to the idea of this thing. They also become good at the hypothetical type deductive reasoning. So they can form hypotheses. They can say, hey, I see this thing is like this. I think it was because of this. And then, if you teach them how to, they can start to test those hypotheses in more complex ways. So they can consider different possibilities and outcomes of a situation, not just one. It's not just like, just happened, therefore it must be this other way around. They also start to be able to do what's called propositional logic. You can take these abstract propositions themselves, which they're now able to understand, and reason about them. So if you're talking about an abstract concept such as freedom, they can start to understand that there is another concept called justice. And when someone violates someone else's rights, we take away their freedom. But it's also unjust to take away someone's freedom. So there is kind of a balance between freedom and justice. They also develop what's called metacognition. Metacognition is where you think about your own thinking. So you can consider what you think, why you think that way, and how you might be able to think differently. You can adjust your strategies for learning, especially when you're first starting out in the formal operational stage. A lot of people will start to develop what's called idealism. People are able to think now about these more complex things like freedom, like justice, like gender, like danger. And it's tempting to engage in idealistic thinking, which is kind of imagining the perfect solution to everything. Because you have the ability to reason about things now, but you don't necessarily have all the knowledge you need to be able to tell yourself, hey, it's a lot more complex than I suppose. Idealism is pretty much the result. And there's a word that I came across when studying Piaget, and the word is pseudo stupidity. And it's kind of the almost the opposite of idealism. Idealism is where you come up with really simple solutions to what are really actually complex problems. But pseudo stupidity is where you take an actually simple problem, and because you can think of so many possible ways that it could have gotten there, you imagine that the problem is far more complex than it actually is, and it becomes hard for you to come to a conclusion about it because you're overthinking it. So pseudo stupidity is basically overthinking things. So in this stage, especially for adolescents, they can become very idealistic, which is kind of underthinking a complex problem, or they can develop pseudo stupidity, which is just like overthinking and becoming kind of stuck and unable to come to a conclusion. So that is Piaget. Very quickly, from birth till around 2 years is the sensory motor stage. You're just developing the ability to interact with the world, to understand that you can change the world and that there are consequences for actions. And then you enter the pre-operational stage where symbolic thought becomes a lot more important. Language starts to develop. And you do all this, though, in a very simple way, only able to consider kind of one aspect of a thing at a time and having a very egocentric point of view. Then around 7 to 12 years of age, you engage in concrete operations, and this is where you can start to understand things like conservation of matter, reversibility of actions, and you start basic logical thinking about rather concrete objects or ideas. Nothing too complex. Then around 12, you enter the formal operational stage. So here, a lot of abstract thinking. You can think hypothetically. You can come up with complex ways to figure out what's wrong. Problem-solving skills develop. But you can also, uh, especially early on, and for some people the rest of their lives, engage in idealistic thinking, trying to come up with very simple solutions to all the world's complex problems. Or you can become stuck because you see what is really a simple problem, but because you have so much more in your head, you kind of overthink it. Like there are so many solutions to this, but actually there's only one really probable one. So that's called pseudo-stupidity. So that is Piaget. It's quite a bit different than what I'm going to talk about next, which is Erik Erikson. Because for Erikson, growing up is really a way of coming to terms with your place in society. In a way, it's kind of a complement to Piaget more than it is an alternative. But until next time, thank you for listening. I am Dr. O'Leary, and this has been an episode of Psychiatry, Caps Edition. Nothing in this podcast should be considered personal, medical, or mental health advice.